stakeholders got together.
And this was that golf course question
Yes.
that you wrote up?
It's an environmental friendly golf course and other interesting issues now embedded in that process.
And you called it a Sustainable Development Committee?
Yeah,
or?
they create a word, Sustainable Development Committee.
Yeah.
So they actually did it to resolve the dispute regarding the local development project, which caused a lot of environmental concerns. So they did not use joint fact finding, but it's an embedded process. So without help any professional controls, about 30 stakeholders got together and then actually made a fact finding together.
I just permitted first geothermal well, PGV, and we were taken to court and lost the case, had to stop the project because there was no ambient air quality standard for hydrogen sulfide at the time. So we ended up, I had a hat on at the time, we didn't have a toxicologist, so I wrote the criteria document to support a new air standard. Of course, there's tens of millions of dollars of construction money being held up here and a lot of pressure to get this standard in place. So I put together the document and it got very complicated very quickly. And although the median level for odor detection for hydrogen sulfide is something in the order of 5 parts per billion, something like that, 5, 6, whatever the number is, the toxic health effects don't occur until you get to much higher levels, 10 parts per million, which is 1,000 times higher than that. And then the issue came up as to whether or not you're setting standards to protect against odor versus health effects. And then it gets to be very, very mushy. And we ended up compromising with a standard of, I think it's 25 parts per billion, something like that. So you're protecting against some odor, but not all of it. And you're, of course, we think, protecting against health effects, although there's data to suggest that even low levels.
Water Code Roundtable, which was kind of a cowboy effort on our part in the about 1986 or so. The state constitutional convention had said thou shalt set up a code for managing water, and it had taken about 10 years of ongoing fights at the legislature and kind of no clarity, lots of contention about what a water code would say. At that point, Peter had started a conflict resolution initiative in the Neighborhood Justice Center that he was the head of, and we brought Larry Susskind out to train a cohort of us to try and think about broader environmental contexts and broader multi-party disputes. So with rose-colored glasses, we launched into this process. I was working for American Factors, or AmFac, which was a large plantation-owning company and managed a lot of water resources. And we conjured up, Peter and I, this notion that we could in fact bring together a group of stakeholders in a period of interim politics. In other words, the governor was just leaving, there was no clarity about what the next political overlay was, it was outside of the legislative process, that we could put together a group of people with multiple interests and make a contribution to this conversation. So we actually kind of launched our own little water code roundtable and pulled together what I think was still a very powerful and logical group of people to sit around the table for, I don't know, probably 3 or 4 months for quite some time each night, late into the night, and wrestled with the underlying concepts of water, natural resource water management, and actually evolved a bill, the guts of a bill. Now again, we had no great eminence, nobody was saying thou shalt do this for it, and everybody needs to play in this room, people had come in and out of the conversation a little bit, but the point is that ultimately when we completed that product and took it to the next legislative session, we found somebody who would champion. And there was a senator who picked it up and said, look, these guys spent a long time talking about this. There's some new concepts in this piece, planning and a whole series of other concepts that were part of the effort. And they became the new add-ons to the state water code that we operate with today, and the bill passed that next year. Now, I don't think we drove that necessarily, but we actually made a fairly significant contribution outside of the world of gray eminence. We had no authority, in essence, to be dealing with this, but we had gathered up a group of people who felt like if they could come to an agreement was possible. I think it actually did shape and continues to be part of what the state water code looks like today.
Think of a case in Tasmania, which is our most beautiful state of Australia, which if the process had been called joint fact-finding, it actually might have been better, but it wasn't. It was more a slog, a negotiation slog. It was around native forest logging. Tasmania has beautiful forests, and it's also had a native forest logging industry for a very long time, which actually carved out a lot of the culture in Tasmania. But with dawning environmentalism, it ended up in what were called the forest wars, sort of 30-year war between foresters and environmentalists. A breakthrough came when the primary company that had been making money and they're now losing money because of effective environmental campaigns wanted to get out of native forestry and opened up the opportunity for a deal to be struck for their exit. And that triggered a government, environmental and industry agreement process which sought to identify which forests were of high conservation value and which were not, and where were they. And they brought in an expert who was subsequently totally pilloried by those who sit in the suit, and I think with a lot of nasty and difficult negotiation they eventually did get to an agreement. I think if it had been called joint fact-finding, if there had been some way of describing an objective process, that would have helped enormously. But they did get there, but there was blood on the carpet.
Did some work a little while ago on looking at if there was a chemical, nuclear, or biological attack, how would, in that case, the government has medical countermeasures, which are antidotes and medicines that help to combat the effects of those attacks. And in that situation, the government was asking, how do you want to receive your medicine or your antidote? And what does that look like? Do you want to go to a central location, or do you want a postal delivery person to come to your house with an armed guard, or do you want a kit in your house? So it was really looking at between those three different options, how do people want to be able to receive those medicines? And the difference between what the experts say and what the general public wants, and how that looks regionally, looked really, really different. So that was the...
Well, I'm not sure that this really qualifies as joint fact-finding, because I have not done any joint fact-finding in a scientific context, except I will say that I'm currently engaged in representing a developer who would like to develop a subdivision in an ag area, and the standards for and the requirements of the Department of Water Supply and the county are antiquated and not in accordance with rainfall standards as well as water efficiency standards that have been adopted elsewhere. And so often, and I know I've got to go in for a variance, but rather than looking at filing the variance and adversary proceeding, what I've been engaged in is I happen to have a developer who will do the homework, bring science and what's happening elsewhere in the country to this problem. And so, because of relationships with both the Department of Planning as well as the Department of Water Supply and the county, I've been able to impact the way that they look on their standards, and that their engineers are actually now engaged with us in trying to see, hey, how do we work this out?
Basically, the University of Hawaii got a large amount of funding from National Institutes of Health to build a biosafety level 3 lab to study infectious diseases, and part of actually, that's what Jess was talking about, it's part of the national network for responding to biological emergencies. Where the trouble occurred, I think, in this is it's a planning project. So you have an environmental process. We did an environmental assessment. You have traditional public outreach, but because it's such a complex and very unique project that raises a lot of fears in people about like having a lab that is studying infectious diseases in your neighborhood, you really do have to go the extra measure to get the comfort levels up, your knowledge levels up about the safety of the lab, what kinds of research is done there, and get into the nature of how a disease really does spread and how it doesn't. And so that was a real struggle, in part because people watch movies like Outbreak, Contagion, dramatic movies that embellish a lot of facts, but they stick. And we also got caught in a sort of little firestorm of local politics where people were looking for visibility and didn't really care about the accuracy of what they were saying. And we ran into a problem with institutional credibility that had nothing to do with our project, but affected it nonetheless. In just wrapping up, National Institutes of Health did recommend to all of the recipients of this grant that they do something along the lines of joint fact-finding. And they call it more citizens advisory committees, where you bring in the stakeholders, including the ones that are opposed, and you keep them in that sort of forum for a long time. You do things where you have dialogues with the scientists, you do tours of analogous labs, and you try to build up the knowledge and the trust factor, and that hopefully that spreads to the wider community. For a number of reasons, we didn't do that, and we should have, and we could have probably, but that I think is a way of dealing with those kinds of dynamics in a very difficult to explain project.
I was once retained by the government of Japan and Ministry of Economy, I think, and they were thinking about ways to store the high-level radioactive waste that eventually comes out of the nuclear power plant, which has to be stored in somewhere for like 100,000 years to make it safe. So it's so scary stuff. And so the government retained me to serve as a facilitator, and I designed the forum, which was actually inspired by, maybe many of you have heard from Larry Suskind's story of the dioxin disputes in Brooklyn. And so I worked with the stakeholders to identify two contesting scientists who said the substance is not safe, but geological disposition is safe. And the other scientist was concerned about the geological disposition. So I organized a 3-hour forum, which one side says, this is safe because of this, and the other says, I'm concerned about this because of this and that. And I tried to facilitate the discussion between these two people, and I think they found some sort of underlying consensus among them in terms of the science, but they are arguing about really minor things on top of the common understanding about the technology. So it was pretty interesting opportunity to serve as facilitator. And the forum was called, it's strange Japanese word, but it's called Bidirectional Symposium.
But what is it called?
Bidirectional Symposium. I don't know why, but in Japanese terms, those kind of symposium hosted by nuclear industry is always considered as some sort of mock-up conference that try to please the safety of nuclear things. So the term bidirectional assumes that there's some sort of real interaction.
Networks, friendships, relationships that may actually make that possible in the near future. The timing is good because they're now in the process of drafting their first ever mediation law decree. And in Vietnam, the way the government works is the opposite of the US. Our law tells you what you cannot do, and so the job is to find ways to do it and get away with it, which many do. Their law tells you what you can do, but you still have to apply to the government for approval to do it. The subsequent stage, which will be much more challenging, will be the development of mediation systems, organizations, mediator qualifications, criteria, recruitment, training, coalescing that system into something constructive. What's intriguing to me is it may offer a possibility, if we do it right, and if we involve the right stakeholders and the leadership levels that we seek to potentially make collaborative problem solving the default process for what would otherwise be legal disputes. So you got to go there, you get impasse declaration from there before you can even go to an adversarial process such as arbitration or litigation. Not there yet, but that's the main concept. In addition to the law, decree, rules, regs drafting, and the system and mediator development, we are looking at identifying and developing user market education and cultivation of receptivity, funding, support, and assistance. One of the key elements of the concept is that the international team would be a resource, not coming in doing standalone projects, have a nice time, eat some great Vietnamese food, make a few friends, go home. A resource available at their discretion. The Vietnamese team would be the leadership. They would research and evaluate the consequences and determine what international resources might be of the most use and value to them, in what manner, at what times, in what ways. Their terms. The information for the joint fact-finding would include not only the history, the culture, the current business environment, the current government environment, the current legal environment, identification of the involved and affected stakeholders, their interests and priorities, shared values, mutual benefits, things that would be part of the process. Because the idea is, if you can identify the subject, the issues, and if you can identify and involve the affected and potentially affected stakeholders and develop point of contact people, leadership people for those stakeholder groups, and if you can get them to agree to come to at least a conceptual theoretical table and engage in objectively reliable information gathering, call it joint fact-finding, you will develop a process and participation that has a much greater than usual chance of getting to objective evaluation and in turn to objective decision-making and action that will take into account the information and the interests, values, and priorities of the stakeholder groups. That's the concept.
I do a lot of work with an outfit in Israel, which is an Arab-Jewish village, an intentional community. And they have a training center called the School for Peace. And they have developed a methodology for bringing Arabs and Jews to the table. And it's a unique methodology. There are a lot of places that bring Arabs and Jews to the table. But it has to do with bringing the power disparities to the table, rather than talking about them as something that's out there. They bring it in and make it part of it. And that's got a long history. They've trained 60,000 people in that model. But what's been interesting is in the last 4 years using AID money, they have taken that methodology and brought together 3 groups, a group of young journalists, women politicians, and environmentalists, 3 different groups, each 10 and 10. And the goal has been not only to bring them together and get them to work together, and although you might think that the self-selection of who would come to such a table would make collaboration easy, wrong, so that it's a tremendously difficult thing, and the notion of fact-finding in the narrow sense of the term, not in the broader sense that we're wandering here, but just in, sort of, is today Tuesday or not, can become very, very contentious. And their output was to be joint projects. They were supposed to pair up. That was the goal of the grant. There should be 10 projects that come out of this, 1 Arab, 1 Jew working together on. So there was a decision-making component of agreeing on a project and parameters and responsibilities and funding, etc. Very successful so far. That is to say, they came to agreements, they have all their projects. Now, whether those projects will continue and go on is something we're now watching and we'll get to see. But it was a fascinating project which had a great deal of, you made the distinction of fact value, no way to make that distinction in this process. Fact and value are so intertwined, and I would add fact value plus political layering, which may be another piece of valuing, but the power dimensions of who's got it, who doesn't, who wants it, who doesn't want to give it up, all of that is really wrapped up in, and what would you like to have for lunch today? So never mind when you're talking about, shall we work on a joint interviewing project with refugees in a camp?
So we have a action research project currently underway with 4 coastal New England communities, and we're helping them think about climate adaptation, how they can prepare for climate change. And at the beginning of the project, a subset of stakeholders, particularly from municipalities and from the Marine Estuarine Research Reserves, which are partners in this project, the subset chose experts to do climate projections, think about local impact, climate change. And then we're engaging a wider set of stakeholders, role-play simulation exercise. So the exercise distills the information, which is available to stakeholders, by the way. The fuller climate assessment is available, but these exercises distill it down into a sort of simpler form, more accessible form, and basically present it for multiple actors to concurrently think about, okay, well, what are the potential implications of climate change, and how might we collectively respond to them?
So I'll talk about a case involving water quality in far northern California, the iconic Headwaters Forest. And the core of the Headwaters Forest was actually purchased through a joint federal-state partnership from Pacific Lumber. Pacific Lumber was an old family-owned company in Northern California that was bought by Charles Hurwitz. Some of you may know that name. He was kind of known as the junk bond king. So he bought this timber harvesting company. He financed the buyout with junk bonds, which motivated the need to very dramatically increase the rate of cut in the forest. So my involvement in this started when I did a training course on environmental negotiation for the North Coast Water Quality Control Board, In California, we delegate EPA water quality jurisdiction to these regional boards. And the director said, well, that's very interesting what you presented. We have a conflict. Do you think you can help us? And the conflict was between Pacific Lumber and the residents in these watersheds that were getting flooded out. So I blithely said, well, we'll try a mediation process. So we created a convening committee. In 7 weeks, we met 5 times, the residents and Pacific Lumber, and we tried to make progress towards an agreement about what to do about this issue. And it was my obligation to report back to the regional board our progress. So there I stood in front of the regional board, and one of the board members said, so, have you gotten them to adopt ground rules yet? And I said, well, actually not. But in that meeting, I said, you know, we can't seem to agree on a way forward, but we do agree we have contested information. And a very good way forward here might be to do an independent review panel process around that contested information. So in that hearing, we actually designed the terms of reference for this independent review. The board members blessed it. We created a process where both sides were able to frame questions and identify experts. We impaneled 7 experts, and the first question that they were looking at was 2 competing models, looking at the rate of timber harvest and water quality. And the panelists wrote their first report, and they made various findings about the differences between these assumptions. But as they bore into the problem, they said, you know, the real problem here is the design of the planning process. The habitat conservation plan you adopted for these forests doesn't address water quality. We need to really step back and look at that and look at how timber is managed. So the panel, in its initial work, worked for 6 months and wrote a report. They suggested questions that needed further investigation. The board agreed. They continued meeting. At the end of it, they came up with a series of recommendations, and those were presented to the regional board in a public hearing, and there were lots of people there to give commentary. The regional board sat on this for about 3 years until their membership turned over. And then they got the courage to adopt the first watershed-wide waste discharge requirements in the state of California, really codifying the quantitative nature of logging. Soon after that, Pacific Lumber decided that it really didn't have a long-term financial stake in this company, and the ownership has turned over, and the company is now run by Don Fisher, who started the GAP, the Fisher Company, much more sustainably and very much like the traditional Pacific Lumber. So this is a very long story, 9 months. This story is 7 years long. But the initial engagement was not joint fact-finding, it was training. Then it was mediation. But as I was pitching this approach, I did call it joint fact-finding. In fact, I even sent my article, which you sent around, to the board members and explaining the logic of the approach. And I persuaded them.
I would like to introduce Utbana's case in the small island in Japan. And the background of this case, there's mainly 2 backgrounds in this case. One is that 90% of this island area is forest, but forestry industry population is 1%, just 1%. And the second is that this island has very close grid, power grid, and all fuels is supplied from outside the island. So the island has a very vulnerable energy system. So the renewable energy using plentiful forest resource is thought to be one of the solutions about that. Then we designed the process of joint fact finding, and we conducted the detailed stakeholder analysis and detailed expert survey for that. And we indicated that, identified that several issues about that, such as identification of potential demand, electricity demands, and or stable supply of fuel with appropriate quality and price. I think the format we applied to this case should be called to joint fact finding, but the issues were not so serious. to the island people. So I would like to say this is a joint factor findings case, but very I'm wondering what is the serious scientific evidence? What is the scientific evidence in this case? It's very difficult to say about that. So I will touch on detail later.